Hello, listeners. Senior producer Jason here.
And Madison, associate producer, and we have some exciting news to share with you.
Our extraordinary host of The Girl with the Same Name and the Make That Paper podcast, Jamie Parker Stickle, has signed a 2-book deal with Thomas and Mercer.
Her untitled debut novel is a psychological thriller about a tenacious former Los Angeles reporter turned mother and spin class instructor who can't help but stay true to her investigative nature.
Strapping her 9-month-old baby to her chest, zipping wherever leads take her, and becoming dangerously obsessed in the process, when 2 young women are found dead at her local hiking trail.
Goosebumps. I got actual goosebumps. I cannot wait to read this book.
Agreed. So stay tuned. Follow the show on Instagram and Facebook and TikTok, where we'll be posting details and updates about the book and the show. This episode contains descriptions of violence and may not be appropriate for all audiences. Listener discretion is advised. This podcast is investigative in nature. The theories and opinions expressed herein belong to the speaking parties and do not necessarily coincide with those of the series producers. Also, we are so grateful that our listeners are interacting with the show in the form of comments and posts on social media. However, we would remind you that this is a true story, and the friends and family of the victim may be reading your posts. Please be respectful of their loss and of their privacy.
Previously, my name is Jamie Stickle, and this is The Girl with the Same Name. We're going to tell you 2 stories, both about Jamie Stickles. One of them is mine, and one is about the other Jamie Stickle, and how our stories eventually meet.
It started as a fire call this morning in the parking lot near the Heinz plant. A Jeep Wrangler was burned so badly the back tires had melted. But when firefighters put the fire out, they discovered a body inside.
My personal theory is that there was someone within the gay community that she had a problem with. And there was some, we'll call it outside or out of the area, people brought in to assault Jamie.
She was a great friend.
She was just like the best person and personality.
She was a wonderful and beautiful person that had the biggest heart of anyone I've ever met.
She was nobody of importance. She was a bartender.
Hello, listeners, and welcome back. Or perhaps it should be you welcoming us back since we've been gone for a while. When we set out to tell the story of Jamie Stickle's life and death, we have to admit we had no idea where the story would take us. Another admission, when we released our first episode 8 months ago, we did not know how our story, or Jamie's, would end. For the past several months, what may have seemed like a break or a pause in our show was really anything but. We have been speaking to witnesses, reaching out to experts, working with attorneys, and even exploring the most remote possibilities and alternative resources, trying to get answers for Jamie's family, her community, and for you, our loyal listeners. If you haven't yet listened to our earlier episodes, I recommend pressing pause and getting caught up from episode 1. As we had hoped, our show has brought more attention to Jamie's story, and as a result, more people have come forth to share what they know about the events that surrounded her death. But apparently with more attention comes heightened concern, and so we have been asked to conceal the identities of some of the people you will hear from on this episode. We first heard from Paul shortly after the release of episode 3, Person of Interest, in which we explored the accusations made toward Sonia Sunny Barrasso, a romantic rival or maybe romantic partner of Jamie Stickles, or possibly both. Barrasso was and still is the owner and operator of the House of Tilden on Liberty Avenue, and is reported to have had some kind of argument with Jamie shortly before her demise. Paul is not his real name, and he asked that his voice not be used on the podcast, so his interview has been re-recorded by actor Richard Warren.
I knew Jamie. I knew her for many years as a bartender, fundraiser, sweetest girl. And what everyone else is saying is absolutely true. And she's always very kind to me. We were never friends, but then we started hanging out. Basically, a few months before she died, we started becoming closer.
And when did you find out about Jamie's death?
The next day, everyone found out. Every conversation led back to Sonny having something to do with it. Not directly, but like you said in the podcast. Everyone still thinks the same way. I missed the funeral, but my friend was there. We had this fear of talking amongst ourselves in the bars as well. He says the funeral, everyone was so freaked out, or like the person being here that did this to her. So everyone was looking at each other like freaked out really badly. And I remember feeling that way at the bars too, but pinpointing back to one person that we all still believe has something to do with it. But there's no solid proof. So yeah, the tone was really awful. It was a bad time in Pittsburgh, in the community, in the gay community. Very dark. We didn't know what to do, how to react to things. Sometimes people would say things to certain people.
Of course, the feeling Paul recalls from over 20 years ago seems to persist today, as he was not the only person to come forward on the condition of anonymity.
She got into an argument with Sonny. I was watching this whole thing unfold. They were yelling at each other, saying things, and Sonny said, "Watch your back."
We'll call this witness Henry, and he is being voiced by actor Chase McCown.
She said that to her in front of everybody. And then a week later, she's dead. And I'm like, oh my God. I mean, she told her, you better watch your back. And that's why, personally, I think that she probably had something to do with it.
We've heard from several people about public fights between Jamie and Sonny, but this is the first perceived threat, and that makes this account important. And in case you were wondering, Henry did give his account to the Pittsburgh police back in 2002, so they were aware of the threat Sonia Verasso made toward Jamie Stickle a week before she was killed. Henry also told us another story that occurred sometime after Jamie Stickle was murdered.
There's this guy, his nickname was Queenie. He was known to be very messy. He was saying things about thinking that Sonny had something to do with Jamie's death, and he got a ride from my friend's house. Sonny offered. This was not her. She would never do this. She offered to pick him up at the house, to drive him to the bar, because she ended up driving him around for a while, and then when he came back, we asked him what happened, and he wouldn't talk about it. He never spoke about it ever again. We asked him more than once, like, what happened in the car, and what did she talk about? She ended up not driving him to the bar at all. She dropped him back off. I think it was about 45 minutes.
Did he seem scared?
He didn't seem scared, but he just wouldn't talk about it.
Were they friends?
No, he was a messy bar patron, that's all.
What do you mean by messy? Like drunk?
Drunk, falling off the bar stools, vomiting in his purse.
While we haven't been able to get Queenie's version of this story, Henry's account of Sonny coming to pick Queenie up, driving him around, and then dropping him back off seems unusual, to say the least. There are so many stories with so many similarities, but also some really critical differences. That's what we found when we talked to someone we're calling Keith. He also spoke to us on the condition of anonymity, and so the voice you are hearing belongs to the actor Justin Baker.
I was at Tilden one time. This was a little after Jamie died, and what I witnessed was some bouncer punch someone. Because the steps are very steep, going up to the bar, walking up a lot of steps. I'm sure so many people have fallen down those steps before, drunk after the bar's closed and the after hours is open. I saw the bouncer punch someone and knock him down the steps. I was there waiting to go in, and Sonny was there, and I seen her walking down the steps, and she said, he fell, he didn't get punched. And somebody's saying to her they seen him get punched. And she's denying it, and then somebody else is calling her a murderer and calling her a liar and talking about blood money. Everybody's just getting in her face, and I just got out of there.
Keith ended up taking this story to the police, and that's where he made some really interesting discoveries.
Did you hear anything about the Heinz factory cameras?
That they
turned them?
Oh, we didn't hear that they were turned.
The detective told us the cameras were all turned away from where the fire was.
This was Joe Myers?
Yes.
What was the context of that? Was he coming to question you, or did you go seek him out?
I think my friend did, and I agreed to meet with him as well. But it's his house, and he took us in separate rooms and asked us questions.
At your friend's house, or?
Detective Joe showed up at my friend's house, and he interviewed me and my friend in 2 separate rooms. I don't know how they got a hold of him, but he had a roommate. I think the roommate might not have been involved in it too. He might have been interviewed. I don't remember. but I know that I agreed to talk to the detective as well. And one of the things he said, why does everyone keep saying that Sonny had something to do with Jamie's death? It was a hard question to answer because it's speculative, you know? And then he told us about the Heinz cameras being turned and about the keys on the fridge. That was the information that I don't think was released.
Do you recall if there was a reason that you could ascertain why he was giving you that information?
No.
Was this like part of a question?
No.
So Detective Myers came to your friend's house, interviewed the two of you, or maybe possibly a roommate, so 3 of you. So how long after Jamie's death was that?
Maybe a month.
And in that conversation with Myers, you mentioned 2 details that were shared with you. Did he mention anything else about the crime scene? Like maybe things you already knew or you heard, but...
He mentioned contents, blood on the door and the Jeep door handle or wherever it was on the Jeep. But he did mention blood on the door and he mentioned lipstick and some items on the ground.
Okay.
I don't remember the exact items. And that the cameras were turned.
Did he say that somebody turned the cameras, or was he telling you that the cameras weren't pointed at Jamie's car, so they weren't helpful?
Well, I don't know. The detective said they were turned.
Here's the thing that's bugging me about what Detective Myers shared. Because, you know, if you called Pittsburgh PD today, they don't want to tell you anything. They don't even want to tell you things you already know, because they were very specific about, if we share details with you that only the perpetrator would know, then we're giving up the edge. And so telling or saying to you that the cameras were turned, that's giving up a major detail that, in theory, only the police and the perpetrator would know. So let's take that off the table for just a second and just focus on him revealing to you that her keys were found inside her apartment.
On top of the refrigerator.
On top of the refrigerator. That's a specific detail that eventually came out in the newspapers, but not within a month of her passing. So that was not public knowledge at that time.
Huh. I don't know why that was a thing. I don't know where she put her keys. I've never been to her apartment. People kept saying she always had her keys on her. They were on her fridge, and someone said they were behind the fridge. So I don't know why that's significant.
Well, it helps determine whether she went into the house.
Yeah.
I mean, it helps police build a timeline and also indicates whether someone called her to come out, maybe someone she knew, versus whether she was like intercepted right when she got there before even getting into her apartment.
Right.
Right, because if she was intercepted before she got into her apartment, those keys would never be on top of the refrigerator or behind it.
Okay, yeah.
There's something else about this that's not adding up. So he interviewed you within a month of her dying?
Yes, that's right.
But that doesn't track with Maria Warhola's story. Here's Jason reading from Marty Levine's article in the Pittsburgh City paper issued on January 27th, 2005.
In November 2002, when Warhola was finally cleaning Stickle's apartment, she found a large set of keys attached to what she describes as a pink dog leash sitting on top of the refrigerator. She called the police, who came and took them, and Warhola says won't talk to her about the find. Warhola's recollection matches a description Stickle's mother offered independently, the, quote, pink belt type thing, end quote, where Stickle kept all the keys to bar doors and bar coolers.
And we have the possible explanation of that from Detective George Sattler. He hypothesized that perhaps if the keys were found at the crime scene and were photographed and were not going to be further processed for whatever reason, then rather than take them into evidence, an investigating officer or detective might have placed the keys inside the victim's apartment, possibly on top of the refrigerator.
When he told me that, I thought, why are you telling me this? I didn't say that, but I just listened.
Well, we've heard some differing accounts about those keys, when and where they might have been found. So whether it was true or not, that was Joe Myers trying to figure out by giving you that. What was he trying to figure out by spilling this fact about these keys?
I don't know why.
So it struck you as weird?
Yeah, that was weird.
Was anything else weird?
The cameras being turned away. Eventually, it was in the city paper.
Eventually.
Yes.
But came out in the paper after Myers told you in that interview.
Yeah.
Okay. So he was revealing information to you that had not been published.
Yes.
It's not new information. We've heard about the keys being found on top of the refrigerator since the beginning. We've even heard it from the Warholas, who declined to go on the record for this investigation, but were gracious enough to speak with us privately. The problem with this is not the information. It's where it came from, when it came out, and whom it was given to, and why. As our investigation entered a new phase, it became necessary to review with our legal advisor, Amanda Moghadam.
I am a California licensed attorney. I passed the bar in 2011. I started my practice in medical malpractice defense, and then I moved over to legal malpractice defense. So I'm a lawyer for lawyers. I do ethics advice. I work in-house for an insurance company, and I'm a big fan of the show.
So just from listening to the podcast, does anything jump out or stand out to you in this case and the way it was handled so far?
I think that the biggest thing for me was the fact that her death was not ruled a homicide and how much that impacted the entirety of it. I mean, I think that that was the ignition point that prevented the case from being solved appropriately, because the police department isn't going to go above and beyond when they don't have homicide as the cause of death. They're not going to be motivated to necessarily get to the bottom of it because it's not showing up as a murder on their books.
Right.
So I think that that was the biggest catalyst for why this is still unsolved over 2 decades later.
Have you had interactions with the DA's office, with medical examiners and the like?
So when I was in medical malpractice, I had a lot of interaction with autopsy reports, medical examiners, that sort of thing. Because it would come up as part of, you have a wrongful death lawsuit, and the first place you would turn would be the autopsy to see what was actually the cause of death, because if it wasn't the doctor's actions, then it couldn't have, if it was something else, if it was going to happen anyways, it was going to be a heart attack, then that would be a defense in the case. So I interacted with some medical examiners in that capacity before.
Got it.
Not so much the DA's office, since I'm pretty much primarily civil. I do have friends in the DA's office, and I know that they have insane caseloads. And so unless something is sitting on their desk as a murder that has to be prosecuted, they're certainly not going to take it upon themselves to try to investigate that if the cops haven't brought it to them.
We heard from Sergeant Brandon Roy in a previous episode that if they don't have a cause of death as homicide, the DA is not going to touch it.
That's right. Yeah, that's absolutely right. It's exactly what we're talking about, which is that you have that catalyst is that cause of death that's on there. And when the medical examiner doesn't label it correctly, or at least I think that's what happened here, but that's just my opinion, there's not going to be a stellar investigation that follows. And what really stood out to me was when I looked at the autopsy report on her was how she had what seemed to be some kind of forced trauma to the head, how you can say that that is somehow undetermined when she's found with blood outside of her apartment. And, the idea of sitting in a burning car while she's still breathing, she had burns on the inside of her esophagus. Shows that she was in some capacity knocked out, right?
Right. Incapacitated.
Exactly.
Yeah. That skull fracture he reported on, the artifactual skull fracture, he ascribed that to being caused by the heat of the fire because there's no evidence in front of him on her body to indicate blunt force trauma. Why not? Because the victim's been burned so badly by the fire. That any evidence besides the skull fracture has been destroyed. And as we've heard over and over again, the medical examiner just examines the body. Unless, at their discretion, they decide to examine other evidence from the scene of the crime as gathered by their own investigation or by the police. And in this case, Dr. Shakir appears to have opted against that.
I also wonder, too, because what was her blood alcohol level?
0.225%.
Right. So, he could have, with the skull fracture, just assumed that it was part of a drunken, knocked her head or whatever. It's from the heat. It just seems like it's easier when someone is under the influence to sort of write off what may have happened.
In your experience with medical examiners, would it be typical for an ME to ask a colleague for a second opinion if they themselves cannot figure out a manner of death?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think it all comes down to resources and time, and how new the person is. Do you have any information on?
From Dr. Wecht, he described Dr. Shakir. He said he's a board certified medical examiner and he's capable of conducting his own.
Right. And so that board certification is actually, that's sort of the, what's the word I'm looking for? Like the gold standard, right? So when any physician becomes board certified, that's essentially their peers have determined that they're just as good as everyone else. So you wouldn't think to necessarily report up or get a second opinion under that circumstances, because the medical profession looks at board certification as the you've made it essentially. And so you wouldn't necessarily have oversight. Like it's different in a hospital setting when you're going through your residency and then you become a attending physician, right? And then the residents report to you. You don't have that sort of situation once you've got a bunch of board certified medical examiners.
Mm-hmm. And of course, in a hospital, your patients are still alive.
Right.
Yeah, with living patients and their families, we know how to appeal. You can ask for a second opinion or talk to the hospital administrator or go to the American Medical Association. You've got all these instruments for appeal. Where does a victim's family or advocate go to appeal an undetermined manner of death?
You could report it to the board that certifies, right?
Okay.
So when you're a board certified physician, that is subject to review, just like you would report any other physician. So it's just, you just go to the board that certified them and to state that this is what happened, and that would be the report. I mean, on something like this, I don't think that the board certification is going to come down on something for a decision that they made 20 years ago.
And the guy's retired.
Right.
And elderly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I don't think it would have any sort of impact here. I do think it's very odd that with a skull fracture, though, that it was listed as undetermined. I don't know, what led that particular medical examiner to come to that conclusion, but it definitely doesn't smell right.
Well, that's interesting that you say that. Have you been paying attention to the case of Ellen Greenberg?
No.
Okay. So Ellen Greenberg was a 27-year-old Philadelphia teacher found dead in her apartment in 2011. This is 9 years after Jamie's death. She had multiple stab wounds. Initially, this was ruled a homicide, but the medical examiner later changed the ruling to suicide. Her parents have consistently disputed the suicide ruling, claiming the investigation was mishandled, and they fought for years to have the case reopened and the official cause of death changed.
Mm-hmm.
The case has seen numerous legal battles, including a recent decision by the Pennsylvania Supreme Court to hear arguments on the matter. The central issue is whether the coroner's ruling can be challenged in court and if the evidence supports a different conclusion.
That's fascinating.
Fascinating. So what had happened was she had multiple stab wounds, but the police determined that her apartment was locked from the inside, and her boyfriend had to break the door down to get into her.
Okay.
To get into the home because she was dead, obviously.
Okay, yeah.
He was pounding and nobody answered. The police finding is what made that medical examiner change before they filed the paperwork to undetermined cause of death.
Yeah. And I think that
manner of death.
I think that happens frequently, right? I do think that there is a overlap where cops come in, they state what they've found, how they found the body, whatnot, state what they think might have happened, and that has an influence on the medical examiner. Absolutely. We're all human, right?
Right.
And it makes sense that would, I don't know if that's specifically what happened here, but I could see if the cops aren't too invested and the medical examiner doesn't have a ton of family there breathing down their necks about what happened, that it's easier to put undetermined than to put homicide, because that's going to involve them having to get ready to go to court to testify. That's going to require a lot more legwork on their part to list it as a homicide versus undetermined.
So this is very interesting, because obviously there are some parallels between the Greenberg case and Jamie's.
And they both happened in Pennsylvania.
That's so crazy, yeah.
But in Ellen Greenberg's case, what appears to have happened is that the police influenced the medical examiner to change his or her position from homicide to suicide. And in Stickle's case, the medical examiner appears to have made his determination without any influence from police or from evidence at the scene. It was exclusively based on his own autopsy.
Yeah, in a silo. Like, just, it was him without any outside influence or input.
No regard to the fact that there was blood outside the door of the car on the ground.
Right.
No notes about anything about the crime scene. This entire autopsy, which you've read, is strictly about the body.
Right.
And we've heard from...
and that's typical. I mean, that is typical. You wouldn't go into necessarily the evidence surrounding a body. I mean, their job is to be a forensic investigator of the body itself and determine what happened. But I just find it so strange what you're saying, that if there's no influence, that they would come to that conclusion with those injuries. It just doesn't make sense. And you never got the investigation file, right? They're claiming it's an open case and therefore they can't release it.
Right. And we've appealed it.
It's so interesting to me how pesky you have to be just to get some basic information when nothing has happened for over 2 decades, and that they can say it's open when there's never been anyone in custody. There's not, as far as you know, nobody's been looking at this except you guys, right?
Right. That's not even considered a homicide.
Right. Why not? Why is it still an active open case if they don't consider it a homicide?
Mm-hmm.
And I just don't understand why a police department would sit on a file when it doesn't seem that there's any interest on their part in solving the case right now. Why not release it to you guys? Why not let it go forward?
Right, exactly. We had someone tell us, a journalist in Pennsylvania, a wonderful journalist, talking about the police. Pennsylvania set up by old laws. She has to have 2 assistants because you have to go request a thing, and then they'll say, no, you have to go over here and get this person's signature now that you've requested it. So she'd send one assistant to go get a signature in another building, come back, and she'd say, okay, now that you have this physical signature, I need you to go to this person and make a request. And then they'll phone me, no email, no electronics, phone me, and then I'll have you run across the street and get a stamp on this. That's how
unnecessarily complicated.
Yeah. And that is how they're still running today. And so it's very complicated, and why it takes years to break stories in the state. Like this woman, Ellen Greenberg, that's 2011. If we're going to look at Jamie's 2002, I mean, hers was 2011. That was a long time ago too.
And it's still going through the court system, and the family's still trying to get the cause of death or the manner of death changed.
Yeah. So when you think about it in perspective of that, you're like, well, there's something wrong with the system.
Definitely.
And that's what failed Jamie, the system. We're not saying an individual failed Jamie and her family in this case, but a system has failed her.
Yeah.
And her family.
Yeah.
So let's talk about this, and you may not have an answer to this, but in the state of California, is there any legal instrument for challenging a determination of manner of death made by a medical examiner? Or are you aware of such an instrument existing?
You did start to say that it would be incumbent upon the family to hire an independent medical examiner.
But that won't necessarily change. That's only if there's a case going to court, I think.
Right. Right. It would have to be that examiner would then appear as an expert witness in a court case if there's a court case.
But even in the case where you have a family that pays for a private medical examination, right? That doesn't necessarily mean, even if they reach a different conclusion, that it's going to change the original medical examiner's conclusion,
right?
Or that the police or the DA would necessarily listen to the private determination.
That's my point. That's not going to change the ME's findings. That is just a tool for court, to, especially if you're on the defense, I would assume.
We were told by the medical examiner's office or by a representative of that office that the only way to get them to even re-look at this autopsy would be to introduce new evidence.
Yeah.
And the same thing was told to us by the police. If you're going to reopen, you have to introduce new evidence.
It's just crazy because here the evidence is already there. Yeah. Right? It shouldn't require new evidence when someone has a skull fracture and a car set on fire in order to make a determination. I mean, we all know that murders of marginalized people go uninvestigated, right? And I think that that's a big part of the story here.
And the thing is, what I keep coming back to is like, I feel like when you can identify the cause of death, but not the manner of death, it's you're going, I don't know. Like it's such a it's a bad look to say I don't know, and I'm done trying to figure it out.
And doctors love to know, right? That's part of the whole thing, is to come to conclusions based on evidence, right?
Science,
it's kind of like not signing the bottom of a letter when you're finished. It just doesn't make sense.
And I'm like, I watch enough Doctor TV. Like when the doctor who is, the best of the best can't figure something out, they bring in their peers.
Right. No, you're right. If you think it's undetermined, you are afraid to put, homicide down on the paper, that's when you call in another professional and say, hey, look over my shoulder, make sure that I've got this, that we're coming to the right conclusion here.
And it's not like he didn't have the world's greatest coroner down the hall.
Right.
Right.
But that actually brings up a question we haven't asked yet. What did Dr. Abdul Razak Shakir think of his boss, the world-famous coroner Cyril Wecht? We haven't asked because we haven't been able to reach Dr. Shakir. But in our research, we did come across an article in the January 31st, 2006 copy of the Pittsburgh Tribune Review, aptly titled Offering Low Profile, by writer Karen Roebuck. In her article, Roebuck announces that
Dr. Shakir, 63, of Fox Chapel, an Iraqi native who lived in Baghdad until 1982, was surprised January 20th when County Chief Executive Dan Onorato appointed him to replace Dr. Cyril Wecht, who was indicted on 84 federal charges and resigned.
Shakir is quoted as saying,
"To me, it's a challenge to ensure a smooth transition at this time of a lot of turbulence. Dr. Wecht is a nationally and internationally known forensic pathologist. I am not. Personally, my choice is not to be a public figure. I don't like the lights, and I don't like to be known on the street. I want to be just a human being who is earning a living and doing my job."
The article shared one of Shakir's goals as the incoming head coroner.
Convincing county officials to increase salaries for the county's underpaid forensic pathologists is one of his priorities, Shakir said, because the low salaries are hurting recruiting efforts. Shakir said he might consider leaving himself if things don't change.
This took place just 4 years after Jamie Stickle had lain on Dr. Shakir's examination table. So perhaps there was more going on in the Allegheny County Coroner's Office than we previously understood. It seems Dr. Shakir may not have had the reverence for Dr. Wecht that his legacy in the public eye would imply. The article also indicated that Shakir was one of only 2 forensic pathologists in the medical examiner's office. Presumably, the other was Dr. Wecht, who was known to travel the country consulting on high-profile deaths, working on television shows, and taking public speaking engagements. We do not know his whereabouts on February 8, 2002, when Jamie Stickle's autopsy was performed. But it now seems entirely possible that an overworked and underpaid Dr. Shakir did not have another colleague on hand with whom to consult on Jamie's confounding manner of death. Or if Wecht had been available, we don't know if the 2 doctors had a relationship that invited collaboration. Either way, we may now have more insight into the mindset of the medical examiner who signed his name on Jamie Stickle's undetermined manner of death.
And you got to think about how expensive and time consuming all of it is, right? Like for the cops, to get the DA ready to go to trial, that takes so much of their time. They're not walking the beat. They're not investigating other cases. The DA is getting ready. Trials can cost the taxpayers up to $500,000 for like a normal 5-day jury trial, right? And so you've got to, I think that human nature is to take that big problem away when there's an easy out.
Coming back to the Pittsburgh police, they have no motivation
right
to investigate this, because if they find anything that could turn this thing that's really not their problem
into their problem.
But again, raises the question, why then are they keeping it to themselves?
Right.
And I think if I'm pulling that thread and speculating on why, maybe because they think someone would find something that could turn this into a murder, that could turn this into their problem.
Right.
Well, if you know it's an imperfect system and we just keep going on around like, oh, it's imperfect, but we do our best and we close the low-hanging fruit, you know, look at this. Look at our numbers for closing cases. I think it's unfair and unjust to all the people left behind.
Right.
And if people are willing, and we have researchers and investigators, podcasters doing the legwork, what's wrong with that?
I think this is how it changes, right? Like, all of my favorite podcasts are similar to what you guys are doing, which is let's shed light on a broken system, because how are we ever going to fix the system if nobody's reporting on it, right?
Right.
We need to report on the system, and we need to keep it front and center in people's faces day after day after day. And we need to keep shedding light on things that people don't really want to talk about because it's uncomfortable, right?
Yeah.
And I think you guys are doing a good job.
We hope so. We are trying, and we're not done. But it is time to step back from Jamie's story as we conclude this first season of The Girl with the Same Name. We will continue to investigate Jamie's story, and we will be back with updates and new developments as they arise. We will continue telling the stories of and seek justice for other victims. There are so many. We believe this is what Jamie would have wanted, for the telling of her story to be the beginning of something. Oh, and in case you were still wondering about the money from the United for Jamie Fund that mysteriously diminished while in the possession of the Lambda Foundation, we spoke to Chuck Hans and were able to get a possible explanation.
When Buzz Pusateri said it's safe and it's in an interest-bearing account, it wasn't in an interest-bearing account. It was in a stock market account.
Okay.
And so I know that before the money got to us, got to the Delta Foundation, the stock market had taken a dive. And so I don't know how much of a chunk of that disappeared that way.
Got it. That would explain a lot.
Yeah, if you look at the stock market from those, I think what year it was that it was moved over. Well, I think you have, did you get the paperwork from Marty about when we received it?
Yeah, it was 2014. So if it was in the stock market in 2008, it would have taken a big hit.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's one more thing we can try to do for Jamie. As we are recording this episode, we are also sending an email to Chuck, Marty Healy, and Julie, Jamie's sister, introducing them so that she can advise them on how she and Jamie's mother would like to see the remaining funds allocated. It's not enough. I don't know if there's anything that could ever be enough. When a person like Jamie Stickle is ripped out of the world, taken suddenly and violently from the people who love her, there's nothing that can mend that wound. All we can do is follow the examples that Jamie left for us. Give of ourselves. Bring out the best in everyone around us. Stand up for those who can't stand up for themselves. Love with our whole hearts. And take care of each other. Before we go, we do have one more surprise for you. We mentioned at the top of the episode that we explored some alternative resources. We have endeavored to maintain the highest journalistic standards in reporting Jamie Stickle's story to you, and have refrained from sharing anything that doesn't meet certain standards of reliability and relevance. But that did not keep us from pursuing every possible lead. So next week, we are releasing our conversation with a person with psychic abilities as she attempts to commune with Jamie and get us answers about what happened to her on a very special mini-sode of The Girl with the Same Name. If you enjoy The Girl with the Same Name, please take a moment right now to subscribe to the podcast and leave us a review. It would really help us out. You can follow the show on Instagram, Threads, and Facebook at The Girl with the Same Name, and you can sign up for our mailing list on our website, thegirlwiththesamename.com. You can also follow us on TikTok, with some new and exciting reviews of the show at TGWTSN. This is an ongoing investigation. If you have any information about Jamie Stickle's life or death, we want to hear from you. Please call our tip line at 412-822-6123 or send us an email to thegirlwiththeSameName@gmail.com, or you can call the Pittsburgh Police tip line at 412-323-7800. If you have photos, video, or audio recordings of Jamie, you can send them to us or share them on social media and tag the show at The Girl with the Same Name. The Girl with the Same Name is a production of Make That Paper Productions. I am your host, Jamie Stickle. This episode was researched, written, and produced by myself and Jason Bieber. Our associate producer is Madison Westenheiser. The show was edited and sound designed by Jason Bieber. Armani Artis is our intern. The original theme song was composed and recorded by Brian Hendricks. Additional music and sound effects are from freesound.org or were generated using Songburst AI. We would like to thank the following people who generously contributed their time and expertise. Our legal counsel is Amanda Mogadam. We received private investigation assistance from Lori Rokenbeck. Our law enforcement advisor is Sergeant Brandon Roy. And Superfan Promotions did our publicity. We would like to send an enormous thank you to all our Kickstarter supporters. Without your contributions and belief in our work, we would not have been able to tell Jamie's story. Thank you, and special thanks go out to Parvesh China, Brian Assman, George Leone, Daniel Alexander, Jim Shepard, Grant Wood, Stephen Skoblick, and April Snow Cass. Thank you, everyone.